There's a new mood in the Global South, says Vijay Prashad, director of the think tank Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. In recent years, developing countries have demanded a stronger voice in global governance. The BRIC mechanism, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, has become an increasingly vital platform for fostering unity and cooperation among Global South countries. Following its expansion in early 2024, BRICS will soon include 9 additional partners, including Indonesia, Belarus, Bolivia and Uganda as of the beginning of 2025. 2025 also marks the 70th anniversary of the historic Bandung Conference. So how has the Bandung spirit evolved in the Global South? How can these countries amplify their voices on the global stage? And how long will it take before a truly multipolar world order emerge? I sat down with Vijay Prashad in Shanghai to explore these questions and gain a better understanding of the evolving role of the Global South in world affairs. I started by asking him what the new mood signifies.
It's a mood because it's the first time we're listening to people, political leaders, movements and so on in Asia, Africa, Latin America, saying that, you know what, we have ideas. We don't need to take dictation from London or Washington or Paris. You know, we don't need to be ventriloquist dummies. You say something, we repeat it. We have our own opinions. And interestingly, when the conflict started in Ukraine or deepened in Ukraine, then countries in the West said to places like Namibia, India and so on, you have to condemn Russia. And these countries turned around and said, wait a minute, we have our own conflicts, we have our own views, we have our own understanding of what's happening in Europe. We don't need to take your views and replicate them. That's why it's a new mood. It's also a new mood because these countries, you can't say, have broken with the West. You can't say the West is powerless. You can't say that we live in a multipolar world.
Not yet.
Not yet. We are far from that. If it were a multipolar world, we wouldn't worry about Western military power. Western military power still dominates the world, which is why it's a new mood. It's not multipolar, it's not a fractured world, it's merely a new mood.
You were talking about the Bandung Conference in 1955 and the non-aligned movement. This is not new. I mean, the term of the third world, right, is not new. Why is there a particular newness to it, especially over the last 10 years?
Well, there was, of course, the Bandung era. Incredible meeting. I mean, there were people from Jawaharlal Nehru, people like Sukarno, Chou En-lai, so many, luminaries gathering there to say that we no longer want to be colonized. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be the slaves of the West. Yes, that's true. And that mood of Bandung, or what we used to call the Bandung spirit,
right,
went from the 1950s to the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a major debt crisis, which unfortunately is called the third world debt crisis. Some countries went to such a great extent of debt that they were never able, even till now, to pull out of the spiral, downward spiral of debt. So the debt crisis killed off the confidence of these countries to say things like, we are no longer your monkeys. As Lumumba said to the King of Belgium in 1960, we are no longer your monkeys, we are no longer your slaves, we are no longer going to just be apologetic in front of you. That Bandung spirit was crushed by the debt crisis. And it took then decades after the debt crisis, the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on, it took decades for countries to rebuild their sense of confidence and clarity. So the mood has returned. It's a different kind of mood. It's not the Bandung spirit anymore, partly because it's not just about decolonization. It's also about the rise of major Asian countries as economic powerhouses, that defines it as new. It's also a mood because the world hasn't dramatically changed. We're still at the level of the mood.
Why the year 2013? Because 2013 is also coincidentally where China touted the Belt and Road ideas. Is that a coincidence?
It's not so much a coincidence. You know, it took a couple of things to happen. One, it took some years after the creation of the BRICS bloc in 2009 for the leaders of the BRICS to establish trust amongst each other. You know, a lot of politics is about trust. It's about understanding mutually where each other, you know, what each other is capable of, what each other would like to do, and so on. So that took a little bit of time.
Right.
But also the US-France war on Libya in 2011 and its aftermath was a great shock to the countries of the South. You will remember during the discussions around Libya, both Russia and China decided to abstain from the resolution. They didn't veto it. They, in that sense, opened a lane for the West to go and destroy Libya. I think these countries were shocked after 2011, 2012. So around 2013, BRICS is more mature. There's less a sense that the West can be trusted with weapons and war. And then the Belt and Road Initiative is put forward. The Belt and Road Initiative is really significant because it helps build the infrastructure for South-South cooperation. Not just for China to trade with Peru or China to trade with Sri Lanka. It opens the door for Sri Lanka to trade with, you know, with Tanzania and so on. The infrastructure becomes southern, not just Chinese infrastructure.
What is your level of confidence that this latest wave of mood is not going to be crushed as the former one experienced? And what kind of role is China potentially playing? And other major countries, you know, the BRICS members?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is, will these countries be able to establish a new development paradigm? Because, you know, moods will live or die.
Sure.
If you can answer the question that are being raised by your populations. There are problems in Latin America, in Africa, in many parts of Asia. If you can't solve the problems of the people, the mood will wither. So what will countries like India, China, Indonesia, what will they do to address some of these issues? You know, there are compelling problems of commodities being exported out of Africa. The new China-Africa discussion has been about industrialization of Africa. Well, where's the money going to come from? How are these countries going to deal with debt? Will they be able to create markets that are resilient and so on? The economics of the mood is very important because the economics helps you solve political problems.
Right.
But also the politics of the mood is important. You know, the United States has been floundering to find itself in this new changed world. It has been struggling. It has not been easy. Mr. Trump is now saying the way we establish ourselves in this new situation is by putting tariffs on everybody. What will this mean? The United States has an enormous military capacity. Will it begin to threaten countries even more? This is a catastrophe. The new mood in the global South is more cooperation, less confrontation. How are we going to get there? It's going to take economic solutions to real problems, and it's going to take a real political clarity about putting peace ahead of war.
Do you think there are some progress or some lessons learned in terms of a development paradigm? For instance, China has been saying, look, we are finding our path in terms of modernization, and we hope the whole world every country in the world finds their modernization. The theme of this year's forum is global modernization, or people talk about shared modernization. Do you think there is a higher level of understanding and practice in terms of founding the economic basis of the new mood?
Well, to be very honest with you, I think we're really starting at a very low level of understanding what are the new development theories. You know, in a way, I would be very frank with you. China has made amazing strides abolishing absolute poverty and so on. But it's still not clear what China's development theory had been to accomplish that. You know, one of the great slogans is, feel the stones to cross the river.
Right.
Well, but do the stones have a pattern? You know, to feel the stones to cross the river is a pragmatic approach to development. After you've attained a certain level of development, you can retroactively go and say, well, we went to that stone first, then this stone. Does the pattern teach you anything? Can parts of the pattern be exported to other countries? Or do other countries have to invent their own development theory? These are very compelling and important questions. And I think part of our serious research has to be to develop a new paradigm, to understand how to lift people out of misery of different kinds. You know, there was the modernization theory paradigm of the 1950s. There was the dependency theory paradigm, a socialist development theory paradigm. We need to really think today, now, with the current situation. We live in a world which is, which is driven by the digital platforms. What is development in this era going to look like for a country that still struggles with illiteracy? So we need to actually build the theory. We're at a very low level, but we're going to get there. We have to work hard.
But there are a lot of cooperation, a lot of collaboration, a new, let's say, wave of enthusiasm. But what is, besides the complexity of finding a paradigm or a model that's never been done before in human history, what are some of the biggest dangers the global south are faced with from the global north vis-a-vis? We're hearing you talk about hyper-imperialism. Help us understand, is that one of the biggest danger you're looking at?
I mean, that is the most dangerous thing. I'm not a person who likes to ring an alarm bell. It's not me. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, based in the West, publishes a doomsday clock. It's a thing that shows you how dangerous they feel the world situation is. For the last 2 years, the doomsday clock has been stuck at 90 seconds to midnight. That's the closest it's ever been. Why is that so? That's so because the United States has, over the last 20 years, unilaterally walked out of arms control treaties. It walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. It walked out of the intermediate range nuclear missile treaty in 2019. This is scary. We don't want the United States to place mid-range nuclear weapons in Lithuania or in Germany or in Ukraine. We certainly don't want any mid-range nuclear missiles placed in Australia or other parts of the area around Asia. We just don't want it. We don't want that kind of threat to countries. The United States has said they don't want to permit China to continue developing. That's a ridiculous statement. China is a sovereign country. It has the right to develop as it would like to develop. In fact, it has made quite remarkable strides. The abolition of absolute poverty, historical. The ability to create high technology for the people, including high-speed rail and so on. Why would you threaten a country saying we want to reverse that? Just because the country is now competing against you and selling cell phones and things like that. The most dangerous thing of our time is the capacity of a country like the United States to use war as an economic advantage. In our document which you cited called Hyper-Imperialism, we said that we are in a dangerous and decadent stage. Dangerous because the West, 75% of world military spending is spent by the West. Dangerous because they actually have shown us that they are willing to use dangerous technology to try to subordinate people. And decadent, this is a very serious word to use, decadent because the leadership in Europe, people like Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer in Britain, Donald Trump now coming back in the US, these men don't have ideas to solve the problems of people, not even in their own countries. In Germany, there's a deterioration of infrastructure. Rather than take care of that, Olaf Scholz is compelled by this war in Ukraine. In France, infrastructure deteriorating. They are spending more money on their military. For what? This is decadence. Solve the problems of your own people. Make sure that in France, poverty can be eradicated. I mean, if China, which was such a poor country in 1949, can eradicate absolute poverty, why should there be poverty in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany? It's an embarrassment. That's decadence. They are no longer taking care of their own citizens. They are spending too much time worrying about what we are doing.
Is that precisely the problem? Because they're not able to solve their domestic issues, they're trying to deflect the blame and make people think that the others are to blame. But how big of a danger do you think, if the situation persists, that we're really going to see a conflict? Because the United States, the way how you describe it, the nations that refuse to change from within, they're going to hold on to what they have been able to claim, the kind of controls that you talk about. Are we going to enter into a more precarious and dangerous area where there will be outright conflict between the rising global south, led by some of the major countries, and the powers who try to, suppress the changes?
I mean, we are already in a catastrophic set of conflicts.
The pace may pick up even more.
I think the pace might pick up. It all depends on how the countries of the global south engage the north in various forums. I think it's very important for countries of the global south to stay together. For instance, with 990 military bases around the world, which the United States has, there's 400 of those bases in the Pacific Ocean. Increasingly, there's unrest in the Pacific Ocean. There was protests in the Solomon Islands, in New Caledonia. The United States is expanding the Darwin runway in northern Australia so it can place nuclear carrying B-1 and B-52 bombers. There's going to be a real unsettling feeling in Australia. I mean, Australia's largest trading partner is China.
Right.
Why would Australia want to get into even further conflict with the Chinese? So I think the flashpoint is how the rest of the world stands with China against this military buildup. I know that there are tensions in the South China Sea with other neighbors. Those are tensions that should be solved diplomatically. Those should not be solved by provocation. Provocation is very dangerous. We don't want to see provocation. We want to see much more diplomatic work. I'm not naive. I know there are issues between India and China. There are issues on delimiting the border. That's very clear. Everybody knows that. It's no surprise. But India and China have to deal with those diplomatically. They have to talk as neighbors, as ancient friends. We have a very long history together. We have a way to deal with it diplomatically. We don't need to accelerate it into the Quad and the Squad and the Indo-Pacific strategy and this warship and that warship and more troops on the border. That's not the approach. There are complementarities between India and China's economy. We need to trade much more. Our trade is embarrassingly low. Right. China trades more with Vietnam than it trades with India. That needs to change, but we can't change that if we allow ourselves to be dragged into a shouting match which can become a shooting match. Rather than have a shooting match, we need to learn to talk in a measured tone, to deal with each other with respect and also self-respect.
How do you look at the kind of public threats that incoming U.S. President Donald Trump has made public? For instance, he warned against BRICS countries if they attempt to create a new currency that he fears could rival the U.S. dollar. He said he would slap 100% tariffs on BRICS countries. What does that signify? And is that kind of made it naked, the kind of intention and the hyper-imperialistic threat that you were talking about?
I mean, it's rather ridiculous because as I've been watching over the last decade or so, countries like China are trading more with countries in the global south. They are not so reliant on the US market. Of course, there's still major trade with the United States. There's technologies from the US that come to China. There's Chinese technologies that go to the US. On the first instance, a tariff like that is going to harm the US consumer. It'll be enormously terrible for them. It's going to harm the US auto manufacturers. Why? Because across the border in Mexico is where many of the US auto companies actually manufacture cars. They're not manufacturing them in Detroit, they're manufacturing them in Mexico. So the harm is also going to hit the United States quite a lot. Secondly, this might encourage greater South-South cooperation. So this may not actually impact too many countries of the South. You slap tariffs on pharmaceuticals from India, India will find other markets for the pharmaceuticals. Problem with the US is it's not self-sufficient in goods and services. It imports a lot. So it will actually get a huge inflation inside the US. You know, when you raise tariffs on certain products, you can't immediately start producing them domestically. No. It takes time. In that time, the economy is going to tank. Mr. Trump is famous for making all kinds of outlandish statements. I don't think he's actually going to be able to do this. United States already sanctions 70% of the developing world. This is hardly a new policy.
But it really shows the kind of naked intention behind and the mentality, you know, they will do whatever to suppress the others. In terms of information, I think you are saying this is one of the last stronghold of Western colonial control over the global South, over the former colonies. How to break that? Has that problem deteriorated because of the onslaught of the digital era? Or are we have more channels to, you know, get into the echo chamber? How do you see the problem?
Well, there's two real holdouts, weapons and information, but information plays a big role.
It's the invisible.
It's the invisible. I mean, look at the way the West concocted the story on Xinjiang. You know, day one, nobody knew where Xinjiang was, never heard the word Xinjiang, never knew about the Uyghur population. But one day they just started talking about it, and then suddenly it became the topic of the hour. You know, everybody around the world was concerned what's happening in Xinjiang. Incredible mechanism of driving a political narrative. Incredible. You know, nobody else has this capacity. There's a genocide happening in Palestine, and the New York Times says, you know, 20 Palestinians killed. Palestinians just get killed. Nobody kills them. It doesn't say Israel bombed a house and killed a whole family. Yeah. It says they just died. It's in passive voice. They're very clever about that. How to break it is complicated. Some of this has to do with our own sense of confidence in our own sense of being journalists. You know, we are not second-class reporters. We are not behind CNN or behind Fox News. We can be better than them. In fact, we are already better than them. So number one is our own confidence in our own ability to stand up. The other is building genuinely good, high-quality media. People like to watch things of a high quality, and I must say, very few governments around the world or very few countries have the capacity to spend enough to build good quality media. But then there's also the receiving ear. You know, China has its own culture of how people like to see entertainment. You put the TV on in China, you put the TV on in India, you put the TV on in Zimbabwe. The culture of the television is different. Because of hundreds of years of colonialism, we've sort of assumed that BBC is the neutral form of television and the rest of us are culturally different. And so many of our channels, news channels, try to replicate BBC. Why do we do that? Why do we take BBC as the standard? You know, this show is not like Hard Talk with Stephen Sackler, which by the way has been cancelled because he had the temerity to talk about Palestine. But why should we copy their format? Why can't we have our own format?
Sorry to interrupt. The thing is, my understanding is the subscription to BBC TV has actually gone up. And what explains that? I think the receiving end is the critical issue. If the people continue to think in the colonized way, this world is not going to change despite the moods.
It's going to take a long time. That's why I prefer to use the term mood than multipolarity. I don't want to exaggerate things. You know, even we sometimes feel that they are objective when we know that they are not objective at all. You know, we feel compelled to bow before them. even we who are in the profession don't have that confidence all the time. You say, oh, let's see what BBC is saying about this.
As if you don't watch them, you miss part of the...
Absolutely. And when I look on Facebook and Twitter and, Weibo and so on, it's very interesting what people share when they talk about international news. Even people in our own country sometimes turn to them. Now, again, it takes time and effort, but it also takes a certain level of confidence. And I very much hope that we don't feel inferior to those reporters. We go and report stories. I was in Iraq reporting the war in Iraq, but people said, well, he's an Indian journalist in Iraq. No, I'm not an Indian journalist in Iraq. I'm a journalist in Iraq. What makes me an Indian journalist and somebody from the United States is merely a journalist? That's ridiculous. You're not a Chinese journalist. I'm not an Indian journalist. We are reporters. We are telling the story. Yeah. But somehow they make us into second class, and we assume that. Our channels assume that. They don't promote the work we do as aggressively as they should, because they think, well, we're never going to compete with them. We are better than them. We should have confidence that we're better than them.
What do you think people in the Global South and governments must firmly hold on to if we are going to see this new unity?
There's a famous Syrian poet, Adonis, who said that our enemies don't break the door down. They crawl under the door like ants. One of the great weaknesses within the Global South is that we have allowed people who have dominated us to tear us apart. I look at all the different struggles and wars and ethnic conflicts and so on. And I think, if you actually bring people into a room, if they build confidence with each other, these are not fundamental problems. These are not their main problems. The main problem in India right now, the compelling problem, is the problem of enduring poverty. It's an enduring problem. You're not going to be able to develop if hundreds of millions of people are poor. And yet, for a lot of people, the most important issue is the undelimited border with Pakistan. I mean, why should that be the real problem? Pakistanis and Indians share a great history together. Right. We share languages, we share, the struggle against the British and so on. We can easily solve a border dispute. That's not what's holding us back. We should be able to share our compelling problems and deal with those, not focus on that dispute. So your enemies don't break the door down. They come underneath like ants. They divide you. They take up the small problems that you're facing and they make them the main problems. You and I, what should we be doing? We should be talking about common interests, doing more stories about common problems, not what are the divisions among people. I understand that for breaking news and for headlines, it's much more interesting to talk about conflict. But we need to report more, not on conflict, but on what brings people together. Otherwise, you get a picture of the world as just rooted in conflict, disagreement, and greed. That's not true. The world is a pretty peaceful place by and large. We need to expand the zone of peace.
Many thanks to Vijay Prashad, Director of the think tank Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for watching. You've got The Point.